It's tonight, isn't it? No, tomorrow. So there's a baseball game.
Alright, so we were looking at the first mechanism and the fact that humans have a pretty ineffective mechanism at this point because we don't feel thirsty until we've already partially dehydrated, right? And then on top of that, we're pretty slow hydrators, so it takes us a long time to drink enough water to rehydrate once we've got ourselves dehydrated, right? So dehydration during exercise is mostly caused by the sweating mechanism, and sweating is one of the body's ways of trying to maintain temperature. So it's to get rid of heat that we're generating. Every time we break down some food to make ATP, we release heat, and so we see big. All of you know how hot it doesn't take very long once you're moving to start to feel warmer. All right, so sweating is one of the ways we get rid of some heat. We start to sweat, that sweat evaporates off the skin, and the evaporative action cools the skin down and cools some of the air down that's passing under the skin. It's more effective in a dry climate than a humid climate. So what we find here, where we're very dry, is that our sweating mechanism does a very good job at keeping us relatively cool compared to what we would be like if we weren't doing that, right? The problem with this environment is it's so dry, right? It comes back to our high-low idea. So if I've got high water here, right, because I'm sweating and the climate has very low water levels because we're very dry, our humidity's most of the time is pretty low, this summer's been unusual, right, then that sweat evaporates very, very quickly in this kind of climate. Plus, we're at altitude, that even adds more problem because air gets drier as it goes high. So we have a double whammy here because we have low humidity and we're relatively high. Right? So it does its job in keeping us cool. The problem in our environment is that we don't even know we're sweating, right? Because it dries so fast, it evaporates so fast, that we feel like we're not sweating, and if we're not sweating, then we don't need to drink. So we have a problem whereby we tend to not drink enough because we don't realize how much we're sweating. When you go to an environment that has very high humidity levels, so I lived in Alabama for 5 years, the humidity was often over 95%, right? It's very humid. So now we've got a different problem because now I've got high water on my skin because I'm sweating a lot, but I've got very high humidity here. So we don't get any evaporation. So what happens when you're in a very humid climate is that the sweat can't evaporate and it literally, you just run water. I mean, you'll just have water running down your legs and your arms and down your back. You're soaked all the time when you live in that environment. And you get used to it and it's actually quite nice. because it feels nice and warm all the time. It's like a little cozy blanket wrapped around you all the time. But it literally runs down your body. Well, that means that you're not very likely, or not as likely, to dehydrate because you're not drinking enough, because you're very aware how much you're sweating. So you tend to drink. But now the sweating mechanism is not keeping you cool like it's supposed to, and so body temperatures can increase to very dangerous levels. So there's different problems around the idea of sweating and dehydrating depending upon which environment you're in. Okay. Let's see. Our susceptibility to dehydration has a lot to do then with these environmental factors. So is it humid? Is it very dry? Is it windy? Because if it's windy, then that increases evaporation rates. If I'm in a weight class sport where I have to weigh in, then athletes in those kinds of sports often deliberately dehydrate so that they can drop down a weight class, and that puts them at risk then of poor performance, as we'll see in a minute, but also of becoming quite unwell if that's not monitored properly. So we see some problems in wrestling with athletes who get dehydrated. We see problems in football, particularly when they come back during the summer, little less in shape than they were at the end of spring, plus they have them outside training like crazy with 900 pounds worth of equipment on. So we see a lot of overheating, hydration problems in the pre-season training when football players come back. Dark colored clothing, so if I'm running and it's hot and I'm wearing dark clothes, that can be an issue. If I've been ill, so if you've had a fever or if you've had a tummy bug and you've had diarrhea and you already might be slightly dehydrated, and then you're going to be more susceptible to dehydrating further as you start training. And age. The older we get, the harder it is to stay hydrated. So when we look at aerobic performance, then we see some pretty dramatic impacts on aerobic performance with dehydration. So as little as 2%. Dehydration can add anywhere, if you look at 5,000 to 10,000 meter runners on the track, 2% body weight loss in water can equate anywhere from 3 to 5% in performance. So I add 3 to 5% time on my performance time for 10,000. A 1% dehydration, 1% body mass dehydration equates to around about 3 to 5 beats per minute in your heart rate. So the more dehydrated you become, the higher your heart rate goes. Rowers, they've looked at rowers, and rowers doing a 2,000 meter race. If they're 5% dehydrated, that adds somewhere around 20 to 25 seconds onto their 2,000 meter time. Right? So for an aerobic performance, dehydration has a massive impact on your time and therefore your finishing spot. And some of the things that we see that do that, we see a decrease in plasma volume, right? Because I'm dehydrated. And we're losing water from the blood plasma, from muscle tissue. Decreased plasma volume, if we go back a couple of weeks to our cardiovascular system, If I've got less plasma volume, then my venous return is going to go down, and therefore my stroke volume goes down. Okay? Because I can't get as much blood back into the heart, and so stroke volume goes down. Okay? The stroke volume goes down. Okay? Stroke volume goes down, and I'm trying to maintain cardiac output because I'm trying to do the best I can to get oxygen and nutrients to the muscles. Then we see increases in heart rate. So that's why we start to see these increases in heart rate as we get dehydrated, because stroke volume goes down, right? And this can become fatal depending upon how dehydrated I become, right? So hopefully we catch it early enough. Let's see, what else? Thermoregulation. So the more dehydrated we become, the less sweat we produce and release. So we see decreased sweat rates because your body's trying to hang on to that water. The decrease in sweat rate, though, impacts thermoregulation, and we see increased body temperatures. Core temperature is the key, right? Doesn't matter quite so much if I feel a little bit warmer out here, but once we start to see core temperatures rising, then we've got a problem, right? And what you might find is if you have someone who's quite severely dehydrated, instead of looking really hot because they're trying to release all this heat, actually what you see is the opposite. They start to get very pale because the body decreases blood flow to the skin and tries to maintain blood flow as best it can to the organs that are important. So they might actually, you might watch and see someone getting paler, and this sweat is, they're not sweating as much as you would expect given how hot it is where we're training, then it's possible that they're struggling. Right? It's easy to take heart rate. Yes, ma'am?
When you get like goosebumps, isn't that a sign of dehydration too? Like when you're running, or like?
Oh, I have not heard that. I haven't heard that one.
Like even when it's hot, like you have goosebumps when you're exercising.
I haven't heard that, but that I'll try and look that up in one of my other textbooks and see if I can find anything on
I
that.
think one of my coaches told me that.
It would increase surface area. So it's possible that maybe it's a mechanism to try to release some heat because the blood flow's less. I mean, I can see some logic there, I just had never heard that before. VO2 max goes down because stroke volume goes down. We're struggling to maintain Q, so we're not getting oxygen to the muscles as efficiently as we should be, and so eventually VO2 max will go down. We start to use more glycogen, and we start to see higher blood lactate levels. Because the workload is getting harder and harder and harder, the more dehydrated I am, we switch to using glycolysis and using stored glycogen, and so we start to see higher blood lactates, and then we fatigue quicker. Right? So all the things that we've learned in the past all kind of come together in the picture when we're looking at what happens with aerobic performance. A couple of other interesting things that they find when they test people's perceived exertion rates. So the Borg scale that I gave you in lab is a scale for perceived exertion, right? Rating of perceived exertion, RPE. When you test RPE, the more dehydrated you get, the higher you score how hard you're working. So not only might you actually physiologically be working harder, but your perception is you're working quite a lot harder. Okay? And cognitive function decreases. So memory, decision making, attention, all go down as you get dehydrated. Well, if you put those two pieces together, I think I'm working really hard and I'm not thinking quite right, then what we see is decreased motivation, and so then we see impacts on training performance as well as actual performance, right? I don't want to train this hard. I don't want to practice today. We don't see the similar idea when we look at what happens in the cold, right? Dehydration in athletes who are cold rather than hot. We don't tend to see the same drop in performance. So they think that the drop is due in large part to the thermoregulation problems. Because when you look at someone who's 2, 3, 4% dehydrated in a cold environment, we don't see the same drop in time. So what about anaerobic? A lot of us are anaerobic athletes predominantly, right? Even if the game lasts for 3 hours, the actual doing the game is an anaerobic event, right? Hitting a ball, catching a ball, running for a short period of time. And we do see some impact on anaerobic performance, but it takes more dehydration before we see the impact. And if we think about that, that makes sense, because what we see initially is this decreased plasma volume, decreased stroke volume, and eventually decreased cardiac output. Well, that's all great, but I don't need that oxygen if I'm working anaerobically. So we get a little bit longer time span before the impact of dehydration. So when I look at strength events, we've got to really be dehydrated more than 5% body mass. All right, remember that we only need a 2% decrease in body mass to see quite dramatic impacts on an aerobic performance. So it's quite a little bit more dehydration to see a problem with a strength type event. Not quite that much when we're looking at muscular endurance. So if I'm doing interval training, then 3 to 4, a little bit more than for an aerobic event, but not as much as a strength event. The research is quite inconsistent when you look at anaerobic work because of all the different, I mean, the events are so different. Is it a power? Is it a strength? Is it interval work? But we do get, as I say, we've got a little bit more leeway before we start to see performance decrease. That doesn't mean that it's okay, right? Because you might, if you're not paying attention, that could lead to you turning an ankle or doing something else that could end up with an injury. Right? When you look at this chapter, then they go on to, there's quite a big chunk of information where they're looking at individual sports. So they look at marathon, they look at wrestling, so you can look at the impact of dehydration in a particular circumstance. So how do I know? Right? If I've got either myself or a family member or a client or a PE student or an athlete who I don't think is drinking enough, or I want to make sure that everybody is healthy because it's an extreme environment, what am I going to do to test? So we can do that body weight, the scale test that we talked about on Wednesday. Right? I can use a scale test. I'm thinking, because I'm not a PE teacher, so I don't have experience with PE teacher, but to do a scale test you have to be new, really, to do it accurately. I don't know if that's feasible with a PE class. Right? You could leave a scale in the girls' changing room and a scale in the boys' changing room and ask them to weigh themselves, but I don't know if that's likely to be quite as accurate. People, especially teenagers, get a little embarrassed and body conscious. They might not want, even if they're in a room full of girls, to get undressed and stand on the scale. Okay. The goal is to maintain within 1%, plus or minus 1% of my pre-exercise value. So again, in PE, maybe I don't have to be quite so careful because we're not going to be working quite as hard. If I could persuade them to just strip down to their underwear, get on the scale, make a note in their diary, come back, stand on the scale. We're looking to try to remain within 1%, which means I've got to give them permission to drink plenty of water during class. Right? One of the problems that they used to have with team sports is that coach would say, no, you can't have a drink right now, you stay right where you are. Well, that's great, but when they collapse in a gibbering heap because they're having a fit and you have to call an ambulance, that wasn't a smart move, right? Never, ever, ever, don't ever stop an athlete or a PE student from getting a drink of water. Just don't. Why? What are you going to gain in performance in training from that 1 minute timeout that they took to go over and take a drink of water and come back? Right? Physiologically, you're not going to gain anything. It's all about control. Right? It's got nothing to do with the training. It's all about, I told you you couldn't go, so don't go. Well, whatever, get down, get over it. Okay. So more than 1% means we're looking at being dehydrated. Then we've got to encourage them to drink a lot, and it takes a while. We could be looking at several hours. Okay. If I'm looking at the actual weight, 1 kilogram is about 1 liter of water. So 2.2 pounds to a kilo, 4.5 pounds weight loss would mean that person needs to drink 2 liters of water to get back to being euhydrated. Well, 2 liters of water is a lot of water. And you're not supposed to drink it all at once, because then all that happens is you increase urine production and you go to the toilet and you don't get hydrated anyway. So you have to take that 2 liters and drink it consistently over time in order to get the benefit and get hydrated again. So the best goal is don't get dehydrated in the first place, right? So another really good hydration assessment that we don't have to do in a lab, there's plenty of really technical, clever lab experiments. They can draw blood, they can do a urine analysis, they can do all kinds of clever things, right? We could just look at color. So a good teaching tool, if you're involved in trying to keep someone healthy, is teach them how to check the toilet, right? And we just have to go, okay, gross, get over it, do it, right? How do I check if I ate too much fat? Anybody know? So if I eat that whole tub of ice cream that night, what am I going to see the next day when I go to the toilet? Okay. Feces will float. The higher the fat content, so ick, yes, brilliant self-monitoring system, right? Because if I just check, if it's not floating, if it's set, it didn't have too much fat. Okay? If it's floating every day, I need to change my diet. Right? Well, I can use the same idea to check for hydration. Because the color of your urine is very closely linked, depending upon the kinds of supplements you're taking, that can skew the data, but it's very closely linked to your hydration status. So, what we want, and you can find urine color charts, there are some really fancy ones. All you've got to do is type that into Google and something will come up. Put this up on the wall in the locker room and teach your athletes or your PE students how to use it. Right? Self-monitoring is a way, it's like giving the kids authority on the playground. Right? Autonomy gives us power, makes us motivated. So if I'm in charge of checking myself, that is a way better way to go than you having to check them all the time. Right? Teach them to check themselves and take responsibility for themselves. It's not your job to keep them healthy, it's their job to keep themselves healthy once they're past a certain age. Okay? So give them the tools to do that. So, well hydrated, plus or minus 1% of my typical body mass, my urine color should be 1 or 2 on the chart. Okay. I'm starting to get dehydrated, -1 to -3% of my body mass, which is enough to impact academic performance and enough to impact aerobic performance. Then I'm looking at 3 or 4. On this particular chart, they put a red line in because they're saying once you're past that red line, you're really starting to struggle and it's going to take some time to get back. Significant 3 to 5% body mass, so I'm coming up close to impacting a strength or power performance now. Then I'm looking at 5 or 6, and serious, anything down here is really pretty serious. All right? This is not a good picture. So, but it's easy. It's easy, it's cheap. And once I've learned the idea of it, then I know whether I need to drink more. And then we can start to say, okay, drink little and often. It's half an hour. Have you had a, we've been in class half an hour. Anybody had a drink yet? Right? I haven't. And I'm feeling thirsty. Okay, so, so you can start to introduce the concept and get them to monitor. Right? How long's a PE class? Hopefully 45, 50 minutes. I suspect at some schools only 20, 30 minutes. Right? But if you're having a 45 or 50-minute PE class, how many times are you going to suggest to your PE students that they stop and go over to the water fountain and have a drink? Okay? Because you've got to teach them the habit. All right, so let's see. Diddle that, diddle that, diddle that. Okay. All right, so there is a very extreme situation where I can drink too much water. Right? So the term for the symptoms that develop is hyponatremia, and it's sometimes called water intoxication, and it's blamed on drinking too much water. That's one of the ways it can develop. It can be sweating too much, because the actual technical problem is not the water, it's low blood sodium. Right? So you drink so much water that your blood plasma increases so much that your sodium concentration gets out of whack. Right? So as I said, it can also happen by sweating too much or not sweating it, right? Low blood sodium concentration, so anything lower than typical,